Thank you, Lowell. In today's terms, that lawsuit was worth over $1 billion, just so you keep in mind, and it was worth every penny of it. Lowell's asked me to start my comments briefly with a war story. So I'm going to do that, and then briefly after that, give you the outlines of what I think is the anatomy of a source. What is it about a source that becomes a source? What motivates a source to become a source, and what are the fears and concerns that most sources have? And then after that, the panel is going to take over. The war story is this. In 1976, as the head of the Civil Rights Division, I inherited some cases involving COINTELPRO. Those were activities by the FBI to disturb and create trouble back in the 60s. The Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, was investigating that. They sent those cases, when they found something that looked like wrongdoing, to the United States Justice Department, and that fell into my bailiwick instead of the criminal division for reasons that were historical. Color of law violations, that is, violations by people who are police officers or have a badge of some kind, traditionally fell to the Civil Rights Division because of the civil rights history in the South. So we inherited those cases, and one of them was black bag jobs that were supposedly illegally authorized by the FBI in New York City to search for weather underground culprits. Now, those black bag jobs that were alleged to have occurred involved wiretaps, raking the appearances, sitting, FBI agents have a lot of horrible things they have to do, sitting in damp basements with a flashlight, looking for something to happen interesting on a telephone, sometimes going into an apartment. They would have a system they called tucking in the person, make sure that no one is inside the apartment. You didn't want to draw a weapon, anything of the kind, but you go in looking for some evidence of where a weather underground person who had blown up, you've got to remember there were some dangerous people in the weather underground. They weren't all that romantic. They had blown up a lot of things, including places in New York and some places out in Colorado and the like. So these warrantless entrance or black bag jobs were at issue, and who authorized them was at issue. And in that connection, the former number 2 in the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover's chief assistant, or one of his chief assistants, was Mark Felt, later to become known as Deep Throat. Mark Felt came into the grand jury at our request. We asked him to have a lawyer. He said, I don't need a lawyer, don't want a lawyer, I am a lawyer. He's an amazingly smart, intelligent, personable, and above all, self-confident guy. And he came into the grand jury, and we began, it's pretty much as we are here assembled today. Instead of this group, there are 23 people sitting together, a table with some lawyers. This would be the witness chair, and then a stenographer. That's it. No lawyers allowed in to the grand jury, as you know, only the witness, other than the prosecutor lawyers. He came in on his own and said, here's what I did. He answered all the questions. He answered them very honestly, very straightforwardly. Yes, here's what I authorized. Here's why I did it. Here's who I talked to. That's my initials on this greenie. A greenie is a little memo sent out by Hoover from SOG, the seat of government. Here's what I did. Everyone listened intently. At some point, I, as one of a few lawyers, said, did you get any pressure from the White House to engage in black bag jobs? Remember, this is Watergate time, post-Watergate. No, I didn't. Did you talk to anybody at the White House? Yes, I did. Who'd you talk to? I talked to so-and-so. I talked to him, talked to her. I talked to so many people at the White House, frankly, at one point people used to think maybe I was Deep Throat, and he chuckled. He went on with the rest of the discussion, the questions, took a break, a little bit of lunch, came back ready to wrap it up. At the end of a wrap-up like this, typically a prosecutor will say to the 23 grand jurors, does anybody here have a question for the witness before we dismiss him? And I asked that question, and a hand went up. Doesn't usually, but one did. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, were you? And Mark Felt said, was I what? Were you Deep Throat? Now, at this point, if you believe that sometimes communications can occur not just with words, but with neon signs, we had a neon sign. His face drained white, and he quickly said no. I stood up from there and said to the stenographer, please stop. And I walked over to him and whispered so no one, and even my own lawyers, could not hear. And I said, "Mr. Felt, I have to remind you that you're under oath. So either you have to answer that question honestly, or because I consider that question to be irrelevant to these proceedings, I will withdraw the question and your answer." He said, "Withdraw the question." Now, at this point, he wasn't white, he was red. I left the room. In fact, we instructed the stenographer to do exactly that, and it was done. I left and went back to my office at Main Justice, which by pure coincidence was J. Edgar Hoover's former office. I'd been moved into that office when I became AAG. On this point, this is the only point where Bob Woodward and I disagree. By the way, he has written up everything I'm telling you in this book called The Secret Man by Bob Woodward. I thought I had a note from him. He says, no, I called him. But in any event, we talked on the phone. And I said, "You've got a problem." And he said, "I know all about it because my friend called me from a payphone right outside the courthouse before you got to the phone in your office. Let's have lunch." We went to lunch, and Bob said a couple of things. Number one, just because someone says they're deep throat doesn't mean they're deep throat. I said, "Bob." He said, "All right, just because someone may provide some information doesn't mean that that's the only person. It may be a whole group of people." Bob. "All right, what are you going to do with this thing, Stan?" I said, "Nothing." He said, "What do you mean nothing? People are dining out on the subject of who is deep throat." "Nothing." "Why are you saying that?" I said, "Well, I have 3 reasons. First is Rule 6 of the Criminal Rules of Federal Procedure, which says you can't be divulging information that's put forth in a grand jury. I'm a sworn officer of the United States government. I take that seriously. Number 2, I think it's irrelevant. It was irrelevant. I gained the information in an irrelevant way. It's irrelevant to the proceedings. And number 3, I'm going to have a lot more fun holding this than I will if I just go ahead and tell you." Over the years, he tested me occasionally, as he discusses in his book, saying, "Are you sure? Stan thinks he knows," whatever. But I did not. I never, until Mark Felt himself a few years ago, 2005, said I am. And then at that point, I got a call from Bob, and he said, "I'm going to write this up." And that was it. Now, it's a fun war story. But there are a few relevant things in it. Why does anybody become a source? I want to just talk for a moment about the viewpoint of the source, the point of view of the source. There have been occasions when I've been a source. I know what that's about. The anatomy of a source is that typically we think of a source as a romantic person, someone who is honest and at great risk to himself or herself, tells the truth for the public good, and ends up in the movies. Jeffrey Wigand is a perfect example. Karen Silkwood, Aaron Brockovich, you could go on and on. I think the reality, especially for the somewhat sophisticated source, like Mark Felt, well, he's the most sophisticated you can find, is different. It's a little different. In every sourcing, there is a transaction. And from the viewpoint of the source understands that there's a transaction. There's something in it for you, and there's something in it for me. And that's important to identify. The something in it that the source believes is in it for you as the investigative reporter is a story. And the source says the worst that can happen is you don't get the story and you move on to the next story. The best thing that can happen is that you're going to get a great paycheck, a raise, some glory, a Pulitzer Prize, and probably end up in a movie. The source says, wait a minute, the risk-reward ratio is a little different for me. The best thing that's going to happen to me is not going to get me notoriety. If I get notoriety, I've got a problem. It isn't going to get me in a movie. It isn't going to get me an award. It isn't going to get me money. The worst thing that's going to happen to me is I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my reputation. I'm going to go bankrupt. My career will be finished. My family will be hurt. I'll probably be sued, and it could be, if it's highly sensitive material, I could be subpoenaed, arrested, indicted, tried, convicted, and sent to jail. Not a great story for the bad side of the risk-reward ratio. So why in the world does the source ever become a source? Why would any of you become a source? Why would I? I think there are 3 basic reasons. The first one is to do what's right. I think when Lowell talks about that you should never underestimate it. A major motivation is to do what's right and to influence events for the good of the country and the community. I think a second reason, and we'll come back to that, a second reason is to be a player. You know, there's a lot of discussion about Kiriakou. Why did Kiriakou do what he did? And the New Republic, there's an article about him, and the question persists there. Why is he? Who is he? Why did he do this? I think the answer to that question is right in the article. There's a little couple of lines where the writer says, when Kiriakou was in high school, he bought a suit, got a tie, went up on the hill with a friend of his in high school to go get autographs from famous people and senators. That's it. He's a player. It's that simple for some people. That's it. They want to be at the center of influence, the center of what's going on. They want to influence events. They want to please people. Keep that in mind. Sometimes a source will therefore go too far. So it's one of the reasons that you want to try, if you can, to divine the true motive of a source. It helps you to discern what the source is saying, what he's doing, and whether he's gone too far. A recent case of that, I think, Scott Shane will talk about this perhaps, but the New York Times had a story a couple of weeks ago about how Iran finally wanted one-on-one conversations with the United States. A couple days later, the story said, well, not so fast there. I looked into that. There was a Turkish diplomat who was the source on that. He just wanted to get things going. He wanted to do what's right. He wanted to see one-to-one. Maybe he also wanted to embarrass the boss. Maybe he wanted to make his career burnished a bit. But he went too far. He went too far. He said that this was going to happen. That's not exactly what happened. So you got to be careful about that. And then, of course, is the third reason, and that is the user reason. That's the source. That's the Mark Felt reason. That's where you, as a sophisticated source, say, I'm going to get as much as I can out of this transaction. I understand the Byzantine rules of the press and the government and how it works, or with my company. I'm a risk taker. I know the rules of engagement. And by the way, it's critically important for you as investigative reporters to know the rules of engagement as well. In particularly the so-called Lindley rule, this deep background rule. It's going to be used more than any other rule that you can find. Know it, understand it, talk about it. Talk about it a bit later if you want, but you got to know it's also sometimes called the snowflake rule, because information, you have to treat it as if it's just a snowflake that dropped on your desk. You don't know where it came from. You don't know you can't identify anybody who's associated with it. Now, all three of these overlap. People do want to do what's right. People do want to be players. People do want to influence an objective policy change, or maybe even get money or their own career. But the one thing that is consistent among all of the motives is that the source is always afraid. The source should be afraid, and the source always is afraid of being burned. Now, what is it that a source today fears about being burned? What specifically does the knowledgeable source fears? Number one, being burned deliberately. Very rare, not a major fear. Most of the time, source says, nobody's going to do this deliberately unless I lie. And by the way, if a source does lie to you, you are entitled to protect yourself as a reporter. And how you do that is subject to further discussion. I think Lee can talk about it as a lawyer about how that works. But most sources are not afraid that you're going to deliberately burn them. That breaches the compact. But number two is the mistake. And under the heading of mistakes, there are things that you've got to look for if you were to understand the source and keep the dialogue open. Remember, once you break the dialogue, your source is gone. Once the dialogue ends, your source is gone. So part of what you need to do is to understand the source, the motives, how you can advance that person, have respect, not patronize the source, but have respect for what he or she is trying to do. That's very important. To keep that going, you have to make sure that the rules of attribution are clear, so that it isn't just saying, here's the rule we're going to go on. Because most sources say this is off the record. Everybody in this room knows that off the record is not off the record. Off the record really means off the record. A source doesn't mean that. A source means, when they say off the record, it means don't identify me. They really mean deep background. Attribute this information to someone, not by my name, my title, or where I am in any way that can identify me. That's the deep background rule. Understand it and sometimes make it clear. Number two, look out for the reporter, editor, lawyer conflagration. I know of a story of a reporter. In fact, in this book, Leak, written by Max Holland, I recommend it, by the way, it's a terrific book. He tells the story of how at one point, Deep Throat, Mark Felt, was leaking, and he leaked to someone at Time Magazine. Time Magazine, terrific reporter, by the way, Smith, Time magazine had to consult their own attorney about something that might be reported, and that was Roswell Gilpatrick, a famous lawyer at Cravath. He was a Democrat, had nothing to do with the Nixon administration, didn't like him, and nothing to do with him, but he was so offended by what he had learned about some of the leaks that were taking place that were damaging other people who were innocent, like relatively innocent, like Pat Gray, that he, Gilpatrick, revealed to the Attorney General information that led the Attorney General to believe that Mark Felt was a leaker. That led to the Attorney General advising the acting director of the FBI, Pat Gray, and the White House. Now, you might ask, why didn't that immediately out Felt and wreck his anonymity? The answer is because Mark Felt was so unusual. If you read the book, you see Felt just bald-faced said, this is not true, and here's why it's not true. He had a very cogent reason for saying it's not true, and it worked. And everybody finally went back and said, can't be Mark Felt. Not easy to do. Very, very difficult to do, but he did it, and it's a great story. Another way in which you can inadvertently out a source is by the voice. If you use phrases that your source uses, be very, very careful. If you have someone who says, what do you know? What do you know? And you use that all the time, you may think that all of us say, what do you know? But inside the Justice Department, we are all going to know that's Joe Smith. He's always saying that. That's Joe. We know by the voice. We know by the phrase. We know by the context. Be careful. Otherwise, you burn your guy. Another thing that happens is that sources talk too much. Happens all the time. And when they relax, the more relaxed they are, the more they talk. You know, we used to have a rule, never make a decision when you're on your feet, and never, ever end an interview, whether it's face-to-face or on television, and say anything. Because it's when you're walking out the door that somebody says, hey, by the way, what do you think of so-and-so? You say, it's trouble. He's lying, cheating, son of a gun. That's the headline right there. That's walking out the door. So you might like that because that gives you a great story, but believe me, sources finally start figuring out what they themselves are doing to damage themselves. Be aware of it. Finally, I want to say that the most important thing today, and I mean, Lowell really put his finger on it, the circumstances have changed. If you look at Daniel Ellsberg compared to Bradley Manning, it's amazing to me. The Nixon administration would not prosecute Daniel Ellsberg. And in fact, immediately after that, the Attorney General set some rules that are still in play today. The Justice Department cannot subpoena your records without approval of the Attorney General, and the Attorney General's got a lot of constraints on doing that. Now, that does not mean, do not think you got a lot of safety in that. That does not mean that other people can't get into your records, because records today are digital. And that means that email is hacked, Twitter, Facebook, cloud, Dropbox, any digital record you make today can be gotten one way or another. You know, the Chinese security agencies, as you will hear, have, according to the Mandiant Group, hacked into the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and have all of their files, including the reporters' files and the source information that those reporters got from their sources, including identifications if you put it in there. You may think, this is fine, this is how I want to do it. I'm going to even have my own notes, I might put it in the cloud. Don't. Tradecraft is now going to be more important than it ever has been. Talk to people face to face, find ways to keep your computer, your laptop dedicated, and keep in mind two words, air gap. Air gap. Whenever you put anything on a computer and you need to move it from computer A to computer B, you must have an air gap. If you try to transmit it, it can be hacked. It can be hacked while it's in transmission. It can be hacked through a virus. So you want an air gap. That means you put it on a disk, and you put it in your pocket, and you take it over here and you put it onto that dedicated computer. I know it sounds crazy, but this is the reality where we are, and there are other people here who will talk about the technology of this a lot more, with more specificity than I can. But please keep it in mind because nothing is particularly safe. If the Chinese security agencies have all this information, it's probably less damaging to you as a reporter than if the United States government has the information. Witness Mr. Manning. But in both cases, it's going to be dangerous to you, and it's going to dry up your sources because word is slowly getting out to the source community, because they read the papers, all of us read the papers, that this is a dangerous thing. You know, there's a group at MIT that try to test they wrote some algorithms, and they said, we're just as a test. This was not an anti-gay thing. They just wanted to see if they could identify gay people by virtue of an algorithm. And they did. 90%, with 90% effectiveness, they were able to hack into, or rather look at, who was being friended and what kinds of emails, and also what was used on LinkedIn, and they were able to do that. That's it, folks. Two things to keep in mind. One is, no one has the big picture. Do not assume for a minute that anyone in the government knows everything that's going on. No one does. You, as an investigative reporter, will get the big picture before anybody who's one of your sources has the big picture. You have a piece. Mark Felt was an exception to that because he got all the 302s, all the FBI reports, but usually the source does not. So be careful about that. And remember that the source may not know as much as you think the source knows. And second, remember that cover-ups frequently work. We think they don't work. That's the usual thing we say to each other. Cover-up, it's never the crime, it's the cover-up. What are they thinking? Well, I'll tell you what they're thinking. They think most of the time, or a good half of the time, cover-ups work. I'll leave you with this. My mother used to say when she was alive, I could always tell a man who had a toupee. I said, why, how can you do that? She says, well, the hairline's a little wrong, the color's a little bit wrong, it doesn't quite match in the back, but most of all, it's that hairline here, the part lines, you can always tell. It never occurred to my mother that a really great toupee was one she couldn't see. Cover-ups work if they're done right, so always keep pushing. Keep pushing. Keep pushing.